You're at a party, surrounded by people, and you feel the familiar weight settling over your chest. Not anxiety exactly, but something more like the exhaustion of translation. Everyone around you is speaking a language you understand perfectly well on paper, but cannot quite speak fluently. They're discussing weekend plans, sharing anecdotes about their day, laughing at references you recognize but don't feel. And you're there, nodding, smiling at the right moments, while simultaneously running three parallel analyses: what they're actually saying, what they mean beneath that, and why the gap between those two things seems to fascinate only you. Later, alone in your apartment, you'll feel something like relief wash over you. But it's complicated, isn't it? Because the relief is edged with a question you've asked yourself countless times. Why is being alone the only time I feel like myself? This is the paradox at the heart of the deep thinker's experience. You don't actively reject connection. In fact, you might crave it with an intensity that startles you. But the kind of connection you hunger for, the type that happens 4 layers down, where you examine not just what happened, but what it meant, what it revealed about human nature, what it suggests about the structures we build to make sense of chaos. This kind of connection is rare enough to feel like a rumor. And so, you find yourself in a strange exile, not chosen, but arrived at through 1,000 small incompatibilities between how your mind works and how the social world is designed. The recursive mind, how deep thinkers process reality. Something fascinating happens in your brain that doesn't happen the same way in others. When most people encounter an experience, their processing moves relatively linearly. Event, emotional response, simple categorization, move on. Your mind does something different. It recurses. You experience the event. Then you experience your experience of the event. Then you notice yourself experiencing your experience, and suddenly you're 3 levels deep, examining not just what you felt, but why you felt it, what that reveals about your past patterns, how this moment connects to broader themes in your life, what it suggests about human psychology in general. This isn't overthinking in the maladaptive sense, though it can tip that way. It's the natural operating system of a mind built for depth over speed. Neurologically, this involves what researchers call meta-cognition, thinking about thinking, but taken to what might be considered an extreme sport level. Your default mode network, that constellation of brain regions active during self-reflection and internal narrative, doesn't just switch on during idle moments. It runs constantly, a background process so fundamental you probably didn't realize until recently that not everyone's mind works this way. The prefrontal cortex, your brain's center for complex thought and analysis, shows heightened connectivity with areas responsible for memory, emotion, and sensory integration. What this means in lived experience, you can't just have a feeling. You have a feeling, remember the last time you had this feeling, notice the subtle differences, construct a theory about why it's different this time, wonder if the theory itself is changing the feeling, find that observation darkly funny, and then feel a wave of exhaustion at the sheer noise of your own consciousness. Is it any wonder social interaction feels like trying to run this entire symphony while also making small talk? The developmental path. How you became this way. You probably started noticing your difference early, though you might not have had words for it then. Maybe you were the child who asked, why, not once but 5 times in succession, drilling down through each answer to find the mechanism beneath. Or perhaps you were the kid who preferred books to playgrounds, not out of shyness exactly, but because the interior world felt more vivid, more real than the games other children played. There's often a moment, you might remember yours, when you realized other people weren't doing what you were doing. Maybe you shared an observation, something you'd noticed about a pattern in how people behaved, and received blank stares or polite confusion. Or you asked a question in class that made the teacher pause and say, "That's a bit beyond our scope right now," and you felt the familiar sensation of having reached for connection and grasped air. These moments compound. Each time you extend yourself at your natural depth and find no reciprocation, you learn something about calibration. You begin to understand that to be understood, you must simplify, translate, reduce your native resolution to something more standard definition. And you can do this. Deep thinkers are often remarkably good at code switching, but it costs something. What you're experiencing isn't intellectual snobbery, though others might mistake it for that. It's more like being a native speaker of a language everyone else speaks as a second language. Technically, you're all communicating, but the nuance, the poetry, the stuff that makes language feel alive, that remains trapped inside you. The developmental path often includes what psychologists call gifted isolation, though you don't need to have been labeled gifted to experience it. What matters is the gap between your processing style and the social average. That gap creates a kind of gravitational field that pulls you toward solitude, not because you want to be alone, but because being with others without truly connecting creates a loneliness more acute than physical aloneness. The protective architecture. Strategies you've built. Over time, you've developed a sophisticated set of mechanisms to navigate a social world that wasn't built for your operating system. These aren't conscious decisions so much as organic adaptations, but recognizing them can help explain why your life looks the way it does. The intensity calibration. You've learned to dim yourself in social situations. Not completely, that would make you invisible, but enough to avoid that look people get when you've gone too deep too fast. You might share 30% of what you're actually thinking, carefully selecting the most accessible tier of your observation. This works for casual interaction, but it means most people never meet the actual you. The parallel processing. You've become adept at running 2 tracks simultaneously, the external conversation and your internal analysis of it. You're discussing someone's new job while also noticing their word choices, the micro expressions contradicting their stated enthusiasm, the broader patterns of dissatisfaction they're not quite admitting to themselves. You nod sympathetically at the surface level while understanding something deeper about their struggle. This dual awareness makes you a good listener, but it also means you're never fully in the conversation. Part of you is always observing from a remove. The solitude reframe. You've learned to recast aloneness as preference rather than circumstance. I'm an introvert, you say, and it's true, but it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is more complicated. You're not drained by all social interaction, just by interaction that stays stubbornly shallow. A 4-hour conversation that goes deep might energize you, while 30 minutes of small talk leaves you depleted. But deep conversations are rare, so by default, you avoid socializing and tell yourself it's by choice. The content substitution. You've replaced breadth of human connection with depth of other engagement. Books, where you can think alongside great minds without the exhaustion of translation. Long walks, where your recursive thinking can run its full course without interruption. Complex projects that demand the kind of sustained focus others find exhausting, but you find meditative. These aren't merely distractions. They're the ways you meet your need for depth when people can't provide it. These strategies work after a fashion. They help you function in a world calibrated differently than you are, but they also entrench the pattern, making it less and less likely you'll encounter the exceptions, the people who could meet you at your natural depth. The paradoxes, contradictions you live inside. The deep thinker's experience is shot through with paradoxes that seem impossible to reconcile, yet somehow you hold them all simultaneously. You're desperate for connection, yet exhausted by most social contact. The need for authentic understanding burns in you, but the process of seeking it through standard social channels feels like trying to dig a well with a spoon. So you're caught between a hunger that intensifies with time and a weariness that makes satisfying it feel impossible. You understand people deeply, yet struggle to connect with them. Your analysis of human behavior, your ability to see beneath surfaces, to understand motivations and fears, this should make connection easier, shouldn't it? Instead, it creates a strange distance. You see too much. You understand why someone is performing their personality rather than sharing it, and that understanding becomes a kind of wall. You're so good at seeing through people that you rarely get to simply see them. You're isolated, yet hate being pitied for it. When others notice your solitude and express concern, something in you recoils. Their pity suggests you're missing something, that you're deficient, when the reality is that you've made calculated trade-offs. You've chosen depth over breadth, quality over quantity. But have you chosen it, or has it chosen you? The question keeps you up at night. You're self-aware to the point of self-consciousness. Your ability to observe your own thought processes, to meta-analyze your emotions, gives you unusual insight into your patterns. But this same ability means you can't simply have an experience. You're always slightly outside it, watching yourself have it, which creates a subtle but persistent disassociation from your own life. You value depth, yet sometimes envy superficiality. You watch people have easy, light relationships and feel something complicated. Not quite envy, but not quite contentment either. Part of you knows those connections lack what you consider essential, but another part wonders what it would be like to just relax into the shallow end, to not need everything to mean something. The altered experience. How deep thinking reshapes reality. Living inside a recursive mind fundamentally changes the texture of daily existence in ways that are hard to explain to people who don't experience it. Time distorts. A 5-minute conversation might generate 5 hours of subsequent internal processing. You replay it, notice details you missed in real time, construct theories about subtext, connect it to broader patterns. This means your experience of time is non-linear. The present moment that mindfulness culture insists you should inhabit, for you, is just one thin layer of a much more complex temporal experience. You're simultaneously in the now, analyzing the past, and projecting futures. This isn't being stuck in your head, it's how your consciousness naturally operates. Self-perception becomes prismatic. You don't have a unified sense of self so much as a committee of perspectives. There's the you engaging with the world, The you observing that you, the you analyzing why you're observing yourself that way, and the you noting the recursive loop with a mixture of fascination and fatigue. This isn't dissociative identity. All these perspectives are you, but it does mean that questions like, how do you feel, don't have simple answers. How do you feel at which level of analysis? Meaning proliferates. Everything connects to everything else. A stranger's gesture in the grocery store isn't just a gesture. It's a data point in your ongoing study of human nature, which connects to something you read last week, which illuminates a pattern you've noticed in your own relationships, which raises questions about social structures in general. This capacity for synthesis is a profound gift, but it means you can't turn off the meaning-making machine. Nothing is ever just itself. Silence becomes crowded. Even alone, you're never truly alone. Your mind is a constant conversation, sometimes generative and brilliant, sometimes exhausting in its refusal to quiet. People talk about meditation like it's a simple matter of focusing on the breath. But for you, the breath becomes a metaphor for the autonomic processes underlying consciousness, which leads to wondering about the relationship between voluntary and involuntary action, which spirals into philosophical questions about free will. Your mind doesn't have an off switch, only different channels. The digital age. New complications for old patterns. The internet should have been your salvation. Here, finally, was the possibility of finding your people, others who think in layers, who crave depth, who speak your language. And sometimes, in careful corners of the internet, you found exactly that. A forum where ideas are examined rigorously, a comment section that becomes a genuine exchange, a late-night conversation with a stranger that goes deeper in 2 hours than most of your in-person relationships go in years. But the internet has also introduced new forms of isolation, disguised as connection. The performance of depth. Social media rewards the appearance of thoughtfulness more than actual thought. You see people sharing quotes about philosophy, posting threads, analyzing culture, performing intellectualism, and it should feel like finding your tribe. But instead, it often feels like watching depth being commodified and flattened. Real thinking is messy, uncertain, full of contradiction. The internet wants thinking that's shareable, definitive, packaged into neat conclusions. Your actual thought process, recursive, questioning, comfortable with ambiguity, doesn't translate well into formats optimized for engagement. The paradox of infinite content. You have access to more ideas, more perspectives, more intellectual stimulation than any previous generation. But this abundance can make the isolation sharper. You can spend hours reading brilliant essays, watching thoughtful lectures, engaging with complex ideas, and still go to bed feeling utterly alone, because all that engagement was parasocial. You connected with ideas, but not with the humans behind them. The acceleration of discourse. Online conversation moves at a pace fundamentally incompatible with deep thinking. By the time you've fully processed a topic, considered multiple angles, noticed your own biases, constructed a nuanced position, the discourse has moved on. You're always arriving late to conversations that have already calcified into opposing camps, each demanding you choose a side before you've finished thinking it through. The visibility of others' connection.
You see evidence constantly that other people are managing what you struggle with. Photos of friend groups, conversations flowing easily, people who seem to navigate the social world without the friction you experience. Rationally, you know these are curated highlights, but the accumulation still whispers, everyone else figured this out. What's wrong with you? The hidden gift. Reframing what you've been told is broken. Here's what nobody tells you, or what they tell you in ways too abstract to help. The thing you've experienced as exile is actually a form of depth perception. Your recursive thinking, the quality that makes standard social interaction feel exhausting, is the same mechanism that allows you to see patterns others miss, to make connections that feel like small revelations, to understand complexity without needing to reduce it to simplicity. The loneliness you felt isn't evidence that you're doing life wrong. It's evidence that you're experiencing dimensions most people move through without noticing. Think about it this way. A two-dimensional being can't comprehend a three-dimensional object. It can only see the cross-section where the object intersects its plane. You're not better than others, that's not the point, but you're operating with additional dimensions of awareness. When you notice the subtext beneath someone's words, when you see how a small interaction reveals larger patterns, when you can't stop thinking about the implications of an idea, you're not overthinking. You're seeing what's actually there in full resolution. The isolation has been real. The difficulty connecting has been real. But it's not because something is wrong with you. It's because you've been trying to force a high bandwidth consciousness into low bandwidth channels. Your childhood confusion when people didn't understand why you cared about what you cared about, that was your first encounter with the reality that different minds have different native resolutions. The exhaustion you feel after social interaction, that's the cognitive load of constant translation. The relief you feel in solitude, that's what it feels like when you can finally stop compressing yourself. And yes, this means some things will always be harder for you. Casual friendship, small talk, social situations where everyone seems to know the script except you. The world is built for certain kinds of minds, and yours isn't that kind. But consider what you can do that others struggle with. Sit with complexity without needing to resolve it into easy answers. Hold multiple perspectives simultaneously. Think in systems and patterns. Find meaning in places others walk right past. The people who eventually become your people, and they exist, rare as they are, will be worth the wait precisely because they can meet you where you actually are. Not 3 levels up where you've learned to perform accessibility, but down in the depths where your real thinking happens. And when you find them, the conversation will feel like finally being able to breathe fully after years of shallow breaths. Until then, there's this. Your mind, for all its complications, is not a problem to solve. It's a particular way of being conscious with its own costs and gifts. The loneliness is real, but so is the capacity for awe. The isolation is real, but so is the ability to understand human experience with unusual clarity. You are not broken. You are not too much. You are exactly the kind of consciousness the world needs, even if the world doesn't always know how to meet you where you live. The depth you experienced as a burden is also a capacity for wonder. Your recursive thinking means you'll never stop finding new layers in experiences others exhaust in a single pass. Your isolation has taught you to be genuinely present with yourself in ways many people never learn. Your struggle to connect shallowly has preserved your ability to connect deeply, rare though those opportunities may be. This is not consolation prize wisdom. This is not "your suffering makes you special" nonsense. This is recognition. You are experiencing the natural consequences of possessing a certain kind of consciousness in a world that operates primarily through other kinds. And while that gap creates real difficulty, it also creates real depth. The question is not how to fix yourself into someone who fits more easily. The question is how to live fully as the kind of consciousness you are: recursive, deep-seeking, meaning-hungry, while building a life that honors rather than punishes these qualities. You might always be somewhat alone in the statistical sense: fewer close connections than average, longer periods of solitude. But aloneness and loneliness are not the same thing. You can be alone and saturated with meaning. You can have few people and know them truly. You can live in the depths and find it is enough. Because here is the thing about deep water. Yes, it's colder, darker, more difficult to navigate than the shallows where most people swim, but it's also where the most interesting life forms live, where pressure creates diamonds, where going down far enough means you'll eventually find others who've made the same descent. And when you do, you'll recognize each other instantly, not by what you say, but by how willing you both are to go deeper still.